you that don't know me, my name is Ninthu and I post true crime and chit chat videos twice a week and occasionally post vlogs and fashion related content. So if that's the type of content you're into, make sure to hit that bell button so that you stay notified every time I post. So today I just got back from work and I'm really not in the mood to get dolled up to film. So you're just gonna get this. Just think of it as like a slumber party where like we're talking about true crime stories, okay? So sit down, relax, get all comfy because today we are going to be talking about the Gay Village murders which took place in Toronto, Ontario from 2010 to 2017. Okay, so let's start off by talking about who the killer was and just some insights into his life. So the Gay Village killer's name is Donald Thomas Bruce Macarthur, and he was born on October 8th, 1951 in Lindsay, Ontario. And he grew up in a farm in Argyll, which is a city in Karwatha Lakes. So he grew up with his biological sister and his parents would often foster 6 to 10 children from Toronto. So he basically grew up in a really busy environment. Now in school, Bruce is said to have been very involved. He used to win a lot of singing contests and he used to be the teacher's pet because he used to snitch on the other boys for any like mischief he would have like witnessed. So of course, because he was a snitch, he didn't really fit in with the other kids. Now going back to his home life, Bruce is said to have been a lot closer to his mother as opposed to his father, and his parents did have a really good reputation where they lived. However, his mom and dad did have many differences in opinions, mainly being because his mom was a very strict Irish Catholic, whereas his dad was a very strict Scottish Presbyterian. And this often led to them often butting heads and just not seeing eye to eye. And they would often argue in front of Bruce and basically whoever else was around. So then at a very young age, Bruce felt like he kind of had to choose a side, and he ended up choosing his mother's side, obviously because they were a lot closer, and it just kind of made sense. However, Bruce's dad did not like that Bruce was a mama's boy, and this would often lead to Bruce getting ridicule and mockery from his father. But Bruce did later on express that he felt like his dad could sense his homosexual tendencies, and that's also one of the reasons why he thinks he was so hard on him. Now, this being said, Bruce did know that he was attracted to other little boys when he was growing up. However, he also had a really hard time accepting his own sexuality because it was very frowned at the time in Ontario. So then this made Bruce feel very abnormal and kind of like he wouldn't get accepted or fit in anywhere basically. However, Bruce ends up attending a school called Fenelon Falls Secondary School, and this is where he meets and starts dating a girl named Janice Campbell. So Bruce and Janice end up graduating in 1970, and Bruce goes on to graduate from a general business degree before getting married to Janice when he was 23 years old. So their marriage is said to have been going good at this point, and Bruce ends up securing a job at Eaton's department store in 1973 as a buyer's assistant. So just a side note for all my Torontonians, Eaton's department store was basically a store in downtown Toronto, which ended up being demolished so that they can build Eaton Center, which we all know today. So anyways, a few blocks north of where Bruce was working, there was a gay village forming on Yonge Street between Wellesley and College Street, I believe. Okay, so let's fast forward a bit to the mid 1970s, and this is when Bruce's father is diagnosed with a brain tumor and is told that he won't live that long. So when Bruce's father starts getting really sick, his mother actually ends up sending him to a nursing home to get like care. And not long after she sent him to a nursing home, she is said to have taken interest in another man. And even though Bruce was a mama's boy growing up, he did not like the fact that his mother sent his father to a nursing home when he got sick and that she moved on so quickly, and he just was kind of disappointed in her behavior. So then at this time, Bruce begins to spend a lot of time with his father at the nursing home, and this is kind of when they really start forming a bond after all these years. So then a bit of a plot twist happens because a few years after his mother sent his father into a nursing home, she is diagnosed with cancer and she ends up passing away in 1978. And his father ends up living for another 3 years after this, and he ends up passing away in 1981. Okay, so let's just rewind a tiny bit. So in 1979, Bruce and Janice are said to have moved to Oshawa. And by 1981, they have a daughter named Melanie and a son named Todd, and they are said to be very involved with the church. And Bruce especially would go to church because he believed in the whole pray the gay away thing and like really thought it would work on him. Okay, so fast forward to the early 90s, and this is when Bruce begins to actually act on his desires, and he ends up going to the gay village a lot after work and stuff and having a few affairs with men. And about an year after he started kind of giving into his desires, he decides to come out of the closet to Janice and basically just tell her that has been living a lie, but for some reason they decided to just stay together and like stay living together. Now, shortly after this, their son named Todd, who is now a teenager, is starting to get in trouble for making all these obscene phone calls to random women that they don't even know. But of course, these calls are traced back to their house and Todd gets caught. Now, this was a huge burden for Bruce and the family because this caused so much financial troubles because they had to pay for lawyers and other stuff to get Todd out of trouble. Now, as if things can't get any worse, Bruce ends up losing his job in the middle of all of this, and so they end up putting their house for remortgage and filing for bankruptcy in an effort to try to fix everything. But of course, it doesn't work, and within months, Bruce and Janice separate, and Bruce ends up moving away to Toronto, Ontario to be closer to the gay community as Oshawa didn't have one at the time. So then he moves to Toronto and he's just living his best life at this point. He's a regular at all the bars in the gay village and just having a good time meeting people and like living his truth. And during this time, he also ends up meeting a man and they end up being in a relationship for 4 years. So I guess you can say that Bruce was just like so happy at this point with his life. However, this all kind of ends when his boyfriend ends up ending it with Bruce, and Bruce just is so heartbroken and he ends up going into like this depression. So then Bruce ends up going to a psychiatrist who prescribes him medicine to basically deal with his emotional despair. And the psychiatrist also tells him that he should like find something he's passionate about and just like work on that as an outlet to cope with his negative emotions. So landscaping was something that he was always very into, but he just never started. So from there, he decided to begin his own landscaping business, and yeah, he was just working as a landscaper at this point. So then in 2001, Bruce hops on a chat line and he meets this young man named Mark Henderson, who was an actor and a model. So they both end up meeting up and having a bit of an exchange, but they do decide to keep in contact so that they can see each other a couple more times. Basically, like a sneaky link or whatever. But then on Halloween of that same year, Mark asks Bruce to come over to see his Halloween costume, and Bruce agrees. But then when Bruce gets to Mark's place, he ends up striking him with a metal pipe, which led to Mark getting knocked out. And when Mark regains consciousness, Bruce is gone at this point, and Mark is kind of just lying on the floor, like so confused as to like what just happened. But he ends up calling 911 and he is taken to the hospital and treated for his wounds. So, like I said before, Mark is just like so confused and so shocked about this whole situation because Bruce was always such a nice guy and he just never gave off like violent vibes to him at all. So he was just like, okay, like what happened? Because nothing really triggered him either. So luckily, Mark had enough of Bruce's information to provide to the police, and police end up going to find Bruce to kind of get his side of the story on like what took place. So then Bruce ends up going down to the police station willingly, and he gives his side of the story, which wasn't much because he claims that he didn't remember anything and he just like didn't know at all like why he would do such a thing and like it just wasn't like him. So basically he was just acting as confused and shocked as Mark. So that being said, on April 11th, 2003, Bruce ends up pleading guilty for assault and he is sentenced to 729 days on house arrest. And it is said that the prosecutor originally wanted Bruce to like actually have time in jail, but then a psychiatric evaluation suggested that Bruce was low risk and was not likely to reoffend. So yeah, that's why he only got house arrest. And during the first year of his sentence, he wasn't allowed to leave his house at all, but then for the remaining days of his sentence, he was able to leave the house, but he had a curfew and a bunch of like probation rules and stuff he had to follow. So some of the probationary rules that he had to follow was that he wasn't allowed in the gay village, like none of the bars, nothing. And he had a restraining order against him. So he basically had to stay at least 33 feet away from Mark Henderson's house and the place he works. And he also had to often like send in his DNA because they had to put it into like the database system and stuff and make sure that he was clean because he wasn't supposed to be doing drugs or anything during this time unless they were prescribed. And lastly, he had to take psychiatric and psychological counseling as well as anger management. So then once Bruce was done serving his sentence, his record was completely wiped of this incident so that like it wouldn't show up in any other criminal reference checks or anything in the future. So as soon as his sentence was done, Bruce ended up making accounts on pretty much every same-sex dating website and app that you could think of. So he was on like Grindr, Growler, and like just a bunch of others. Now on his profile, he actually made a specific point that he was looking for men that were submissive and into BDSM. So Lil Bruce was a little freaky freak, so it seems. Anyways, around this time, Bruce's landscaping business was doing really well, and he was basically the CEO of a really successful business. Most of his clients were actually wealthy elderly women, and his clientele was basically built just from word of mouth from these women, as they would tell their friends and family to basically go to him and like stuff like that. During his off season though, Bruce actually worked in Agincourt Mall as Santa Claus, and people really thought he was a good person, and he was just very well known as he would make really nice like floral arrangements and stuff for local charities. So it kind of just gave off like good person type of vibes. So on December 5th, 2010, Bruce actually goes out to a bar at the gay village called Zippers, and he is there with a 40-year-old named Skandaraj Navaratnam, who was a Sri Lankan refugee and who Bruce had sexual relations with since 1999. So Skandaraj was known as a charming, kind, and charismatic guy who worked at Bruce's landscaping business at this time. So yeah, they end up going to Zippers and they end up seeming to have a good time because they end up leaving together. But then 5 days after he is seen leaving the bar with Bruce, he is actually reported missing by one of his best friends. Now investigators literally have zero leads, so they kind of just assume the worst because they have no idea why he went missing or like who could have caused it. However, during the time of Skandaraj's disappearance, there had been a post online that investigators found on an accountable website made by an anonymous user that claimed that he had eaten a man in Toronto. So they also looked into a link between Skandaraj's disappearance to Luca Magnotta, which is a whole nother case I can discuss another day. But both leads were ultimately discarded because there was literally no evidence to support this theory. And even though Bruce was seen leaving the bar with Skandaraj on September 5th, he was not suspected of any wrongdoings for some reason, and he was not brought in for questioning either. So then on December 29th, 2010, just 3 months later, a 44-year-old man named Abdul Basir Faizi, who was a Afghan immigrant who was new to Toronto, goes missing. Now, Abdul Basir Faizi was known as funny and smart, and he was also known to be a very loving father to his kids. Now, he was reported last seen leaving his workplace on December 28th, but bank records were able to give more clarity on his whereabouts after that, as they were able to track his spendings to the gay village. So it is said that Abdul Basir was actually told early on in his childhood that it would be best if he keep his homosexual tendencies to himself, as it could be dangerous otherwise, as it was very frowned on at this time and in his culture. So this basically resulted in him keeping his true sexuality a secret from both his friends and family, and he ends up growing up and having a wife and kids because he's too afraid to live his truth. So then on December 29th, he is reported missing by one of his cousins, and his car is actually found next to a small ravine, which was a little popular meetup spot for men. And keep in mind that this meetup spot wasn't too far from where Bruce kept his landscaping equipment. So then police basically just look around the area and everything for any sign of Abdul Basir and just try to find him, but they are unsuccessful and they're only able to find his car and some of his belongings scattered around his car. In divorce papers that Abdul Basir's wife later on filed, she claimed that the investigators basically thought that he had just abandoned his wife and his kids, which did not seem like a justifiable theory for people that knew Abdul Basir himself. So then in October of 2012, a 58-year-old man named Mahit Kehan, who had been a regular in the gay village since the 90s, decides to go for a drink. And Mahid was also an Afghan immigrant who felt like he had to keep his sexuality a secret because of everything he's been told growing up. Now, a few months prior to this, Mahid had actually lost his partner and decided to romantically pursue Bruce as he had seen Bruce often at the bar scene, specifically at the Black Eagle, which is where he ends up approaching Bruce. Now, Mahid was last seen on October 18th, 2012, but was not reported missing until a few days later on the 25th by one of his adult sons, as he had not heard from him in a long time and it wasn't like him to go MIA like that. Now, an anonymous tip linking Bruce to Skandaraj's and Mahid's disappearance is given to the police, and a year later, on November 11th, 2013, police decide to interview Bruce. So basically, the police were told that Bruce had been romantically involved with Skandaraj and that he was last seen with Mahid. However, when they asked Bruce about it, Bruce denied the claims. He basically said that he was not involved in a romantic relationship with Skandaraj, but that he did know both men and that people may be confused because him and Skandaraj did interact a few times at the bar scenes. He also says that he had employed Mahid to his landscaping business and that they did have a quick sexual relationship. However, they did end up ending it and they haven't been in contact ever since. So then the little investigation of Bruce's involvement basically concluded that there is no evidence to support that Bruce could have been linked to either disappearance, and he was basically cleared of all suspicions, so he was just like a free man. But then I think this investigation kind of phased him because he decided to go dormant for a few years. So during the time that he had went dormant, he had some family issues that he had to attend to. Even though his separation from his wife Janice was very messy and toxic, it seems like they had reconciled as they were back to having a cordial relationship. However, his relationship with his son Todd was still very bad. Todd, like I had mentioned before, was a bit of a problem child and he also had a really hard time accepting who his father was and like his father's sexuality. But in 2014, Todd is still up to his old antics and he is still obsessively calling and harassing women on the phone. So then again, police get involved, and this time Todd is not so lucky as he is sentenced to 14 months in jail and is ordered to go live with his father after his sentence is over. So then he goes to live with Bruce, and Bruce puts him straight to work in his landscaping business. And then apparently one of Todd's friends end up coming over and like he ends up just staying with Bruce and Todd. And he accidentally goes into Bruce's washroom and sees a bunch of pictures around the walls, basically of Middle Eastern men naked. So then he ends up mentioning it to Todd, and Todd kind of just like laughs it off, but neither of them had realized at the time that these men in the photographs were actually the same men that were missing. Now, in August of 2015, a 50-year-old Afghan refugee by the name of Soroush Mahmoudi is reported missing by his wife. Now, Soroush was known as an easygoing jokester who liked to go camping and play soccer. But yeah, he was last seen on August 14th, 2015, near his house, which was the day before he was reported missing. Now, unlike the previous disappearances, police couldn't really link him to the gay scene, but prior to being with his wife, he was in a 4-year relationship with a trans woman openly, and so police felt like it could be possible that the same suspect involved in the other disappearances is probably involved in Sarush's disappearance as well. But of course, just like the other disappearances, police had zero leads and they had no clue what could have happened. So then the cycle kind of continues for a while. So I'm just going to speed through some of the other victims. Just keep in mind that these victims were basically connected to Bruce, as they had either worked for his landscaping business at one point or had sexual relationships with him, or both. So Krishna Kumar Kanigarnum was a 37-year-old Tamil Sri Lankan man who came to Canada looking for a brighter future, and he was known to his family as the responsible one. So when his family noticed that they hadn't heard from him in a while and that his phone wasn't working, they were worried, but they didn't report him as missing because they thought that maybe he was just hiding because he was scared that the Canadian authorities would send him back to Sri Lanka. But ultimately, Krishna was killed in January of 2016 by Bruce Macarthur. So Dean Lisawick was a 47-year-old man who is known as a sweet guy and was very artistic. He was known to have developed a few mental health problems, but he was always someone who would stick up for his fellow sex trade workers in the gay village. Now, although Dean was never reported missing, he was last seen in a Toronto shelter where he was admitted in April of 2016, which is the same month that Bruce ended up killing him. So Salimi-San was a 44-year-old man who was born in Istanbul and grew up in Ankara. He was known as a kind and tender human being who was philosophical about things and looked through a lens of curiosity and deep emotion. So Salim was last seen on Easter weekend of 2017. He was last seen near Bloor Street and Ted Rogers Way, and Bruce ended up killing Salim not long after he went missing. So Andrew Kinsman was a 49-year-old man who was openly gay and who was unapologetic about who he was. He is known to have been very happy, upbeat, and a high-spirited man. He was very active in the community and was very known and popular in the gay scene. So Andrew had actually known Bruce for 10 years prior to his disappearance, as he was a bartender at the Black Eagle. And he is said to have had a sexual relationship with Bruce, and he also helped Bruce with his landscaping business. So Andrew was actually reported missing right away, and surveillance footage was actually pulled from where he went missing, and it showed him getting into a car on the passenger side. But the surveillance footage wasn't like clear enough for the police to really see the plate numbers and like all those like specific details, but they were able to get the model of the car. So it was a 2004 Dodge Caravan with chrome siding, and it was red. However, at the time, there was about 6,000 people that had owned a caravan in Toronto. However, there was only one person that owned the 2004 model. So then when they looked into whose car it was actually registered to this random guy, and they went and like questioned the guy, but he ended up telling them that he had actually recently sold the vehicle to a man named Bruce Macarthur. So initially they pull up to Bruce's place in the hopes of basically catching him, but his car is not there, and so there are basically the police in uniform, and there's also a few that are not in uniform, so they basically look like just random people on the streets, in hopes that they could find him and this car somewhere. So it wasn't long until they found his car at an auto parts shop, and they immediately get it towed. So then they end up searching it and they find remnants of blood, which ends up being the blood of Andrew Kinsman and Salimi-San. Now, this allowed police to obtain a general warrant to search Bruce's apartment, and so they go there in hopes of like finding more evidence and like more links to the other disappearances, but they are unable to find anything. There is no like fresh paint, there's no remnants of blood, there is no like new carpets or like just anything that would kind of give them the idea that something had taken place at this apartment. However, before they leave, they decide to clone one of Bruce's hard drives from his computer, And while looking through like his hard drive and stuff, they found recently deleted photos of the men that had been reported missing. And these pictures were post-mortem, and they were actually dated to the days that they were last seen before they were reported missing. So now around the clock surveillance is put on Bruce, and the police are told that if they see Bruce basically going into his apartment with any other man or like just anyone, to intervene immediately, as they didn't want anyone else to be harmed in this process. So then on January 18th, 2018, police barge into Bruce's apartment and apprehend him, as they had just witnessed him taking a young man up to his apartment alone. Now when they enter the apartment, they see the young man tied up, and he looked shaken, but he had not been harmed yet. And much like the other victims, he was a Middle Eastern man who Bruce had met through an app called Growler, and they had actually met up several times before this one encounter. However, luckily the police did get involved this time, because this would have been the last time this man would have been seen alive. Because not only was the man tied up in his bed, but Bruce also had a bag ready to like suffocate him, and he had also taped his mouth shut. So then by this time, police felt confident that they had enough evidence to convict Bruce of the two men's DNA that they had found in his vehicle, but they were very desperate to find the remaining men, as they did believe that Bruce was involved in their disappearance as well, and they were honestly just desperate to find their bodies. So once again, they decided to search Bruce's apartment to make sure they didn't miss anything, but they couldn't find anything, and at this point they're really desperate, so they decide to look into Bruce's landscaping business and the houses that he basically worked for. So then they end up obtaining 5 warrants for different properties that Bruce had worked on, and the people that basically lived in these properties were basically barred until they finished like searching everything. So then once they get to one of these homes, the cadaver dog actually gets really like invested in these pots of like flowers, and the investigators were actually like kind of like surprised at this point, because they thought they would be like digging into the ground and stuff, but the dog just wouldn't let up on these pots. So they end up taking the pots to the coroner's office and wait for the results to come in. And days later, police actually announced that they had found remains of at least 3 people in the flower pots that they had obtained from that house. So then they add 3 more charges to Bruce. And then on February 8th, just a week later, police announced the discovery of 3 more people's remains that were found in flower pots of other residents. So then at this point, they expand their search. They initially only had warrants for the 5 homes, but now they're just like seizing plant pots from all across town to see if there's any other remains that they need to find. So then Thomas Donald Bruce Macarthur's hearing begins on February 4th, 2019, and not long after, on February 8th, 2019, just 4 days later, he is sentenced to life in prison, and he is actually eligible for parole after 25 years. So during his hearing, he is reported to have not shown any remorse, and it's believed that he would have continued this spree if he hadn't been caught. And I know what you guys are thinking: how can a man that had committed all these murders be eligible for parole after 25 years? But basically, this had come up during the hearing as well, and what the judge said was like, he's an overweight man with type 2 diabetes, so he probably won't even make it 25 years. But yeah, that's basically the end of the Bruce Macarthur case. What do you guys think about this case? It's a very shocking case for me to think about, honestly, because it hits so close to like home. But I feel like I say this all the time, but I really just don't understand the thought process people have when they commit these crimes. But yeah, what do you guys think about the case? And let me know if there's any cases you guys want me to cover. And yeah, that's basically the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Give the video a like if you liked it, comment if you want, and subscribe if you want, and like always, keep shining.